Hello and welcome to another episode of Top Deck, the series where we take a look at some of the leading TCG deck lists. And on today, once again, we have Lewis, who managed to make top cut at the recent Exeter Regional, playing a very teched out version of Altergeist. So we've seen him playing some very interesting versions of the deck before. There was quite a nice one where he played triple trap trick and a lot of 2-off traps. And now we see him really pushing the boat out here with quite a lot of interesting stuff thrown into this build. What we'll do is we'll run through the list itself, and then he's given us some explanation for the tech choices in here. So we'll go through that, and then we'll do the usual process of covering the rounds, the siding strategy, and other information. So 2 Absolute King Backjack, 1 Conqueree, only 2 Marionetta, but triple Meliseek, 1 Faker, and 2 Silquatus. So a little bit different from what you'd normally expect from the Altergeist lineup. Triple Ash and 1 DD Crow for hand traps, and there is a triple imperm in here as well. 2 Shadow Beast, 1 1-for-1, triple Extravagance, 2 Manifestation, 1 Protocol, double Compulsory Evacuation Device, triple Fiend's Griefing, very important in the modern metagame. The impermanences that we mentioned, the Dynamiscuses, double Succession. This is really interesting, so let me just explain what the effect does. So it says activate one of these effects, also after that set this card face down instead of sending it to the graveyard. So the first effect you can do is you can send a monster from your hand or face up field to the graveyard, and if you do, add a flipped monster from your deck to your hand with the same attribute, but a different name as that monster before it was sent to the graveyard. So any of your darks can be turned into a Shadow Beast using this by just sending them from the field or the graveyard. That does include Linkaribo, which is very, very interesting. Then the second effect, you send a flipped monster from your hand or face up field to the graveyard, and add a monster from your deck to your hand with the same attribute but a lower original level as that monster. So what you do is you turn any of your dark monsters into a Shadow Beast in your first turn, the trap sets itself, and then you use it again, get rid of the Shadow Beast and get yourself your multi-faker. And when you do that, the beast will actually trigger its effect when it's sent to the graveyard, so it lets you draw 2 cards. It lets you draw a card when you do that. So essentially you've gone for free into your additional pluses, which is really nice, and the trap will also trigger your faker. So additional ways to get to your faker, that's pretty cool, to be honest. Then what else do we have? So we have double Torrential Tribute as just a very powerful trap, and triple Trap Trick. Now interestingly here, he has not opted to play personal spoofing, which is a very unusual choice, to be honest. Normally we would expect to see this, so I'm wondering if he's got some explanation for that, but let's carry on for now. So 1 Chimera Tech Mega Fleet in the extra deck, triple Hextia, double Prime Banshee, double Phoenix, 1 Unicorn, double Linkaribo, 1 Avramax, double Almirage, and 1 Wee Witch's Apprentice, which allows you to get over the Inspector border. So the majority of this is fairly well established, having the 4 Meliseek targets pretty reasonable. You might actually expect, given the list and the fact that he's playing this Subterra Succession, you might actually want to switch to a 3rd Linkaribo since you have more ways to trigger it off. But sometimes the arrow from Almirage, or just the fact that it's so easy to summon Almirage, is really important as well. For the side deck, triple Lancia, double Ghost Ogre, and 1 Chanel Dragon. Of course, you can add this with the Succession, triple Evenly, of course, double Heavy Storm Dusters, 1 Imperial Order, and triple Solemn Judgment. Decided not to main this, which is pretty interesting. It is such a good side card. Anyway, so that's pretty reasonable, to be honest. Let's go through his reasoning for the different card choices then. So, Subterra Succession allows you to search the multi-faker by pitching the Dark Flip Effect monster, which means that opening this or Trap Trick with any dark monster is a 2-turn search for multi-faker, and you've got quite a few darks in here anyway, so that's very strong. Shadow Beast is the best Dark Flip Effect monster to send with Succession in order to search the multi-faker, so that's a fairly reasonable choice. The Absolute King Backjack, it was mainly played as it was very synergistic with the Dark monster being sent to search the Shadow Beast. Also, the deck contains 20 traps, plus 1 protocol, so it's very likely to actually hit with this. The Dynamiscus, he says, ties the deck together because it's another card which makes drawing into the previous 2 monsters usually not an issue. As with Trap Trick, Succession, and this, there are 8 ways to make your monsters in hand actually decent. Fiend Griefing is, he says, just brilliant with the backjack. DD Crow is an alternative card that you can actually search with Succession. So if you already have the multi-faker and you want another piece of interaction, you can just get yourself to this instead, which is quite cool. As for Trap Trick, he says it's absolutely the best card in the deck. There are 7 different targets, which fills the gap whenever you need to. And a notable cute combo here. So if you have Subterra, Succession, and Dynamiscus, and Shadow Beast, or Absolute King Backjack, then you can Chainlink 1 your Dynamiscus and Chainlink 2 your Succession. So you discard the Shadow Beast and the Backjack on the same chain. This means that you then stack the new chain as Chainlink 1 Beast and Chainlink 2 Backjack, so you can look at the top 3 cards and pick one to draw it off your Beast, which is really cool. And then you additionally get your normal trap set due to the Backjack, and you get 1 card for your draw for your next turn. So that's really a nice little interaction there for any enthusiasts of this strategy. Let's go on to the rounds then. So this was a 7-round event, and Lewis ended 6-1 from this. So kicking things off with an Arrow Mage match of all things. Scoring 2-0, he says he didn't really know what Arrow Mages did beforehand, and he still doesn't know what they do even after playing against them. He doesn't think that the opponents seem to draw very well in either game, and stopping Lone Fire twice and Brilliant Fusion seemed to help quite a lot. Round 2 against Sky Striker. Another 2-0. Game 1 he almost threw it away because he forgot that he banished all of his Phoenixes. So he needlessly summoned a Paleo, thinking that he could out the opponent's second There Can Be Only One. The first one out it with the Dynamiscus, and then he did eventually out it using a Concrete to negate it, and then later bounce with the Silk. Game 2 was much longer, where the opponent started quite far ahead, but Lewis had double Ghost Ogre and was able to back-to-back hit both the Shizukus without Array being engraved, and a multi-roll for the second one, which, whilst he started fairly far behind, allowed him to slowly get back into the game. They very nearly went into time with Lewis down on life, but fortunately he managed to get his way into multiple Hextears in time to win that one. Round 3 against Thunder Dragon, this should be a fairly reasonable matchup. And he says game 1 he had a pretty slow start, but managed to get into it when he drew into an Altergeist monster, which happened to was a Meneseek in this case. He had 2 Dynamiscus engrave and a Manifestation, so was able to make Avramax with Faker in hand, so his Silk couldn't be attacked. Very strong there. And then in game 2 he opened 6 monsters without Marionetta, so went Meneseek, Ascend the Colossus, and go into Link Revo, and that was somehow enough that the opponent didn't kill him. And then he drew and then used Evenly in the following turn to get back into the game in the preceding turns of play. So a 2-0 there against Thunder Dragon. Round 4 against Sky Striker again. This is the loss from the event, going 1-2. So game 1 he lost very quickly to multi-roll and main decked Twin Twisters. Game 2 game 2 Lewis almost lost just as quickly. The opponent cleared his whole board except for 1 Subterra Succession and ended on Shizuku and multi-roll, setting 3 to get double engage, anchor and jamming waves. But Lewis had a heavy Storm Duster, allowing him to hit the multi-roll and the jamming waves, and then Faker was able to come in, but it got hit by a Widow Anchor, which was stopped by the Succession, so that's a pretty nice interaction there. If they attempt to Widow Anchor your guy, you can just Succession it away. That still left Lewis massively down in card advantage, as the opponent was able to resolve the double engage, but the opponent had no Moisture or Widow Anchor, and very soon no Shizuku. So Lewis was able to very slowly get back into the game and eventually win by beating the opponent down with a Shadow Beast, with around 5 cards in deck. Moving into game 3, unfortunately, here they started with 3 minutes on the round, and obviously Sky Striker opponents are able to clear the relevant stuff, being a back row and a Link Rebo, and get to the battle phase as time was called, and obviously there's no out at that point, so losing this one 1-2. Round 5 against Salamangreat, going 2-0. The opponent didn't open very well in games 1 or 2. Game 2 was the one where all tournament the opponent... one game all tournament where Lewis managed to open Imperm and Faker, but the opponent didn't even summon a monster turn 1, so didn't even need it. Round 6 against Allcast, a 2-1 here. So game 1, the engine did everything it was supposed to, and Lewis was able to end on Succession, Pitch Beast, Search Faker, and then subsequently snowball advantage with the Altergeist cards and Succession giving him pluses by cycling through the Absolute King Badjack, the Beast, and the DD Crow. Game 2 started very well with the opponent having evenly, but Lewis had a Lancia to follow it up. But the following turn he had a second evenly, and Lewis was down to only one manifestation with Silk in the graveyard to have one bounce every turn. This did end up being enough for a few turns. Silk bouncing the manifestation as cost means that it kills itself when the cost is paid, so it can't be impermed, which is quite cool. But unfortunately, they both unbricked at the same time, and whilst Lewis did make a small comeback, the opponent was able to get all of his dead advantage out of the hand and then perform the full Orcus combo, and it was too much. Game 3, Fiend Griefing was MVP. Obviously, if you can shovel away the Orcus cards, you're in a pretty good position. The final round, round 7 against Thunder Dragon, a 2-0 here. Game 1, Lewis went second and had Ash for the opponent's Raw. So they ended on Titan Pass with Matrix in hand. Lewis went Melanseek, attack. The opponent just popped it, so he got to search the Faker. And then there was an Imperm plus Faker on Lewis's turn to clear the opponent's board, and it was absolutely game from there. Game 2, the opponent ended on Colossus plus Eradicator for 4 cards in Lewis's hand. Luckily, Lewis did not draw into a trap on his second turn, but on his third he drew Extravagance, which hit 2 more traps, meaning that the Eradicator in total got rid of 6 cards. Somehow the opponent's hand wasn't good enough, and Lewis was able to survive because the opponent could not beat the initial 2 cards of Silkatus and a Conquery, and then he drew into Ash, and Lewis managed to just claw his way back off the Eradicator once it had worn off. So very impressive comeback there in the final round in order to claim a top spot here. So really interesting list. And obviously there's so much that's different from a typical Altergeist list, so I did want to grab his siding strategy here. So the most common matchup we expected to face in previous formats was Orcust. And obviously you want your Lanciers in here, and he's also putting in the Judgments for this too. Actually, going first, he's taking out the Imperms, which is quite interesting. Also taking out 1 Trap Trip, 1 Dynamiscus, 1 Shadow Beast. I suppose if you have access to Lancier or Judgment, you shouldn't need to worry too much else about what's going on, so you can take out some of the one-offs, or some of the ones of 2-offs. And then it's very similar for going second, except we keep the Impermanences in, take out the 1-for-1 since it's meant for a turn 1 combo, take out a Backjack, and a 1 Fiend Griefing, obviously much slower in games 2 and 3 if you're going second. For against Sky Striker, Judgments, Dusters, Imperial Order, and Dragon all coming in. Nice to have that spell trap removal there with the Dragon, actually. Obviously, Compulse and Torrential doesn't do an awful lot here, and the Imperm also doesn't put in too much work, so you can take that out too. For going second, obviously you want all the good stuff, the Evenlies, the Ghost Ogres, you keep the Dusters because the format is slow enough in that match that you're just going to be popping off their advantage and putting yourself ahead there. And the same kind of stuff coming out. We actually see the Fiend Griefing coming out again, the 1-for-1, 1 Trap Trick, and 1 Impermanence there. For Thunder Dragon, going first, putting in the Judgments and Lanciers, and taking out the usual Impermanence, Trap Trick, Dynamiscus, and Fiend Griefing. So these are sort of like your removal stuff that you don't super need for turn 1 because your Melanseek puts in so much work anyway. And then for going second, putting in the Evenlies and the Lanciers, which is pretty much fair enough. Taking out the Torrentials, the 1 Trap Trick, 1 Dynamiscus, 1 Fiend Griefing, 1 DD Crow, all pieces of interaction which aren't super impactful when you're going second in this particular matchup. For Salamangreat, there are 0 changes for going first, but for going second, triple Evenly comes in, and 2 Torrentials and 1 Dynamiscus go out. So that's it for the siding strategy. Just a few more questions then. So I asked him how the event was overall. He said it ran fairly smoothly. Staff and judges were very friendly, although he did hear some people complain about some rulings, but personally he had no issues. The only issue for him was that it was a little bit cramped and there wasn't really enough room for playmats side by side without some overlapping there. Why did he decide to play this deck? Well, he says he's not got any big events coming up to test for, as he's not going to Milan. He thoroughly enjoys playing Altergeist, and this seemed like a really cool idea, which would be a lot more fun than a cookie-cutter, polished build of the deck. His hardest and easiest matchup. So he says Orcust is a very good matchup because Silk and Protocol both interact very well. The fact that this build means 3 Fiend Griefing and 1 DD Crow makes it even better than starting with your generic lists. Thunder Dragon is also pretty good, but for harder matchups, the other control decks, so like Sky Striker and True Draco, are really hard to interact with, and they don't really care much about your Silquatus or your Protocol. As for what's unusual about this deck, quite a lot, as we've seen. All of the strange texts here that exist within the main deck are very unusual. 3 Trap Trick is slightly out there as well. Most people are just playing 2. And there's a lot of sort of standard cards which he's not playing, the main one being the Personal Spoofings. Also, he's only playing the 1 Protocol and no Solemns in the main deck. We've already been through some key information on why he's playing these major cards, but he did say that in ways that they helped or hindered, Fiend Griefing was especially good in the Orcus matchup, and Subterra Succession really helped generating value against these Sky Striker opponents. Having Dynamiscus in the main deck was very strong, because it's searchable out to the usual Spell and Trap floodgates. As for changes, he's not sure what the solutions are, but the big problem with the deck is side decking. The main is very finely tuned for consistency, but when you start siding, you often need to take out the normal traps to play more outs to reboot, so you normally take out the hand traps and the Solemn Judgment, which unfortunately makes the backjack a lot more likely to fail to resolve properly, as much as you'd like it to. The most influential sets would be Savage Strike, because obviously Subterra Succession is what makes this whole deck possible. And for upcoming sets, he's pretty excited about Ignition Assault, because there's going to be Lightning Storm in there, which will obviously make it very hard to play a deck quite like this. As for shoutouts, he says that the idea was seen from a deck that topped an OCG event, so thank you to the person who originally came up with this. Also shout out to the Bristol guys he went with, who also did very well, and most importantly to his wife Zoe. So thanks very much for coming on again, Lewis, and showing off this Altergeist strategy. What do you guys think of the cool text that have been brought in here? What's your opinion on Subterra Succession? Would you play it? Is Shadow Beast the correct flip effect monster to run with? And are there any other changes you'd make to the list, or would you run it as it is and try it out for your regional or higher events? Let me know in the comments section, and I'll see you guys in the next one.